excuse me, little froggy, but who isn't after you've been to exciting sessions at conferences and maybe attended a few receptions? I don't know. Thank you all for being here this morning. It certainly shows your interest not only in what's happening here in British Columbia, but the potential that it can have around the world. We've heard certainly just now from Professor Muller about what that can mean from his perspective. We have a panel here to discuss some of the other implications of that. And how we're going to conduct this session is I'm going to introduce the panelists. They will give you a brief introduction to their standpoint and their participation in this panel, where they're coming from and what ideas they have around it. We will then move into a question and answer session. And for those who have not been part of a panel discussion here yet at the conference, you will find on your tables these lovely little cards. And if you have questions for the panelists, we'd ask you to fill those out, wave them around, and a lovely volunteer will come to your table and collect your question and bring it up to me to ask our panelists. Even better if you can direct it at a specific member of the panel, but we certainly welcome questions to all. I am not going to take a lot of time to introduce my own perspective on this, except to say that there are very many difficult jobs in government, and I thoroughly enjoy the one that I have as Minister of Environment. But if you take a look at my mandate letter, I think one of the most challenging mandates I have is to ensure that I can work together with the Minister of Natural Gas Development, the Honourable Rich Coleman, to make sure that we in British Columbia have the cleanest liquefied natural gas in the world, and to make sure that we remain leaders in terms of climate action around the world. Many people have asked me how you can possibly square that circle. I think our appetite has been whetted for that discussion listening to Professor Muller. But now we have a chance to listen to some even wider perspectives. So I'm going to begin, Professor Muller, I don't know if perhaps you've covered everything you wanted to in your keynote, but a moment for you to address the audience and lead into our conversation.
Well, I could speak now for 3 hours on the various topics. I think the key point here is to recognize that for all of us, and I'm sure everybody in this room considers themselves to be environmentalists, that there are problems, that the two biggest problems in the world today are air pollution in the developing world and global warming. And global warming, you could debate whether it's good or bad. Air pollution, there's no issue there, that this is terrible. And that when you're thinking globally, you need to think globally not only when you are analyzing the results, but when you are acting. Don't lose that global view. When you're acting, think about the effect that what you're doing will have in China, can have in China. If you can reduce air pollution in China, if you can reduce the Chinese emissions, then that is big. That's what I call the 700-pound gorilla in the room. And focus in on that. Don't act globally. If you act globally and just put grass on the roof of your convention center, it makes you feel good. And then 30 years from now, when people are dying all around the world from air pollution, when there is terrible global warming, you will be able to sit back and say, yeah, but I didn't contribute. I did my part. And that's what you don't want to be in that position. Let's stop global warming. Let's stop air pollution. Let's take the actions that have a global impact. It doesn't do any good to set an example if the example you're setting is one that the developing world can't afford to follow.
Thank you very much. And next, we have Zhao Lijian. Mr. Zhao is Program Director of the China Environmental Management Program at Energy Foundation China. Mr. Zhao.
Thank you. It's really been a great pleasure to be attending this conference, and also it's a good opportunity to share some of my views here. And it's very enlightening to hear Professor Muller's keynote address, and actually I agree many of his points, particularly about the air pollution parts. Actually, in the past few years, I have been working on the air quality issues in China, and As you have heard from Professor Mueller, the China's air quality has reached a crisis level, and its impact is huge on the public health. And the public and also the government is deeply concerned by the air pollution, and the government is also taking actions. For example, from last September, the China's State Council developed an action plan for air quality, and this March, the Premier Li Keqiang, in his address to the People's Congress, declares the war on pollution. So this demonstrates the government's commitment to really clean up the air. But there's a lot of things need to be done, and serious efforts need to be taken. The key causes for air pollution in China is the coal consumption. China consumes 50% of the world's total coal. That means China consumes the coal consumption more than the rest of the world combined. So there's the big problem for air pollution and also the big problem for the climate change. In the State Council Air Quality Action Plan, there's a mandate to reduce coal consumption to control air pollution in the key regions. So the central government set the cap for coal consumption. It says by 2017, you need to peak your coal consumption and also reduce. So this is a strong mandate from the central government to the local government. But how the local government is going to meet these targets is a challenge. Because the economy is still growing and the energy consumption is still growing, so these regions have to come up with alternative energy solutions. In our view, the energy efficiency and renewable energy should always be the first priority to replace coal. But in the short term, these are definitely not enough. So natural gas becomes one choice. China's need for natural gas is real and strong, and actually China is even considering coal gasification, is using coal to produce synthesized natural gas to meet this natural gas demand. But the coal gasification is, from an environmental perspective, its life cycle, greenhouse gas emissions and water impacts are huge, much worse than coal itself. So we think, from this perspective, importing natural gas from the international markets to China is much better, environmentally, than the coal gasification, solution. But there are still, issues with natural gas. We think there are still critical environmental issues related to natural gas. First, it is still fossil fuel, and even if we all switch to natural gas, it will not solve the climate change issue. So we need to still build the energy efficiency and in the long term renewable energy to really play a big role. So natural gas should be complementary and also encourage the development of the renewable energy development, not to compete with renewable energy. And secondly is about its own environmental footprint of the natural gas industry. I learned a lot from Professor Mueller's presentation, and I think two of the most important issues maybe like water and methane leakage. I think there is still not a consensus, especially among the methane leakage. I really hope that you are true, that you are right, and we can get relieved that we can use this natural gas. But I think there are still different views from different experts. Maybe we need some more confirming studies and testing and these to achieve more consensus in this area. And also to develop best practice, especially for the industry, to, in the meantime, to develop the industry best practice to reduce its impacts and to show the world that this is within the acceptable levels. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhao. And next, we have David Collier, who is president of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers.
Thanks, Minister, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to comment briefly on three areas, the first of which I think has been covered already in a rather compelling way, and that's the global context and the fact that we need to look at BC LNG in that broader context. The second is why Canadian LNG and how we can compete on a global basis, and the third, just a couple of quick comments on how all that fits into the carbon policy framework in BC. So first of all, I think abundantly clear that BC LNG needs to be looked at in a global context. Energy demand continues to grow, as all of you know. It's going to continue to grow for the foreseeable future. Hydrocarbons are going to be a significant part of the energy mix for the foreseeable future. And the opportunity, I think, is to try and find ways to reduce the carbon intensity of that energy mix as we look out over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And natural gas has got a very large role to play in that. I would, having been to China frequently, I would argue that the air quality issues are at least as big a driver in China for increased use of natural gas as is the GHG issue. So global scale opportunity for Canada to play a significant role in bringing natural gas to China and to other Asian countries. Second point, why Canadian LNG? Well, obviously we've got an abundance of natural gas in Canada. We need a market outlet for that natural gas, and I believe we can compete on a global basis in providing supply to global markets. But there is a market window, and we always need to keep our eye on cost and competitiveness of supply from Canada versus the many other countries against which we're going to compete. We broadly agree with the objective of competing on a GHG intensity basis against like competitors. And that's a good thing, and I think it's something that our LNG proponents in Canada will strive to do, but always, again, keeping an eye on the cost equation and on competitiveness. And I would highlight the fact that industry in Canada is already demonstrating leading practices in much of what we do, whether that's flaring, leak detection, many other aspects of what we do along the natural gas value chain. And I think it also means being very pragmatic about the flexibility in fuel source for the LNG facilities, and again, along the entire value chain. Many people will have views on this. Marin's organization, others have put out studies, and we'll continue to see more studies around the diversity of views on this subject. But I would represent that cost cannot be looked at in and of itself. Cost is part of a complex decision process that includes considerations around reliability, redundancy, many other factors. I worked for Shell for 30 years. I know how these decisions are made. They're not made any differently, I don't think, in Shell than in Apache or Chevron or Petronas or many of the other proponents who are looking at projects. They are a complex assessment of a variety of factors over a long period of time, with the risk assessment being an important part of that decision-making process. And I think giving proponents who are putting up billions of dollars for these projects the flexibility to assess those risks and to make fuel choices is an important dimension of trying to be competitive. If fuel sources other than natural gas are competitive, are reliable, don't require redundancy, they're going to get serious consideration. And if they can be in that mix, demonstrated to be economic, I'm sure the proponents will look very seriously at them. And finally, on carbon policy in BC, I think as all of you know, LNG facilities in BC will be, at least for now, the only LNG facility subject to a carbon tax in North America. A carbon tax in BC that's world leading in many respects in terms of how the tax is applied in BC versus many other jurisdictions against which BC LNG proponents are going to have to compete. And I think we need to strive to be leaders across the full value chain, but we need to look at that in a cost competitiveness context. We all want an LNG industry to thrive in BC, and we're only going to do that if we can be competitive. And we need to think beyond the borders of BC. And I think if we look at it in that context, to me, that's a reasonable definition of success. That's a reasonable demonstration of leadership in a global context. And I think it strikes the right balance in terms of looking at a prospective LNG industry in BC from both an economic competitiveness standpoint and a responsible development context in terms of environmental performance. And I think, as I said, I think if that can be achieved, then I think we're on the path to do that. That's leadership, and that will be a successful outcome.
Good. Thank you, David. And last on the panel, we have Marin Smith, who's the Director of Clean Energy Canada at Tides Canada. Marin.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for having me here today. We've been asked to speak to understanding the role that natural gas plays in climate change, so I thought I'd start with a bit about the understanding of climate change. Thanks to Richard for giving us a great opening there about the compelling need to address it. So what is the science telling us about climate change, and more importantly, what do we need to do about it? The IPCC report that came out this spring is really clear that we need to reduce our fossil fuel use to just 20% of what we're using now by 2050. And recently, the head of the International Energy Agency stated, an expansion of gas alone is no panacea for climate change. Natural gas may be the cleanest fossil fuel, but it's still a fossil fuel. And a golden age of gas would not be a golden age for climate change. They put out just 2 weeks ago their Energy Technology Perspective report, and it says that the world's electricity supply needs to be flipped within a few decades, from 68% fossil fuels now to at least 65% renewables within a few decades. So the science is telling us that we need to move to a predominantly renewable powered system. What are the markets telling us? I don't know if you're tracking the renewable investment the way we are, our organization is. Last year, $1 trillion was invested in renewable energy. And so with that kind of investment, I'm feeling like renewable energy isn't alternative anymore. And Citibank and Bloomberg New Energy Finance are showing us that renewables are already approaching grid parity with combined cycle gas in some jurisdictions. And in the past 5 years, the price of renewables has really been plunging, actually far faster than people anticipated. The price of solar modules has dropped 80%. Global wind turbines dropped 35%. So renewables are on the verge of being competitive, even in a marketplace that doesn't put a price on externalities like carbon. So what does all this mean for the role of natural gas in climate change? The science and the markets are saying that we require renewables and that they're feasible, but we all know it's not going to happen overnight, and there really is a role for gas. We don't see natural gas as the villain. I don't quite see it as the savior either. I'd say there's a role for it as a bridge fuel in the near term. It's going to be needed to replace some dirty coal and for heavy-duty trucks, trains, and shipping, but if gas is going to really have a role in solving the climate change issue, it needs to be produced with the smallest possible carbon footprint. And here in BC, the government, as we've heard from Minister Polak, has committed to produce the cleanest LNG in the world. So we did a global scan to find out what is the cleanest LNG from a carbon perspective. And we found the facilities in Norway and Australia that have the smallest carbon footprint. So we looked at what's being proposed for here in BC, and could we meet that? So what's being currently proposed has about 3 times the carbon footprint of the cleanest LNG. We asked our modelers to look at what could we do? Could we meet that benchmark? Is it possible? What are the implications for carbon and for competitiveness? And is there really a business case, to Dave's point? So there's good news. We can do it with existing technologies and in a way that's cost effective. It would require using renewable electricity at the LNG facilities, and in the upstream, using renewable electricity to power the gas production in the fields, as well as carbon capture and storage, and some basic technologies to plug the leaks that exist now. All of these technologies do exist. If we put these in place, we could stand up and say we had truly the cleanest LNG in the world. But we have heard from some of the proponents about issues like reliability, questions about whether it could be built on time, and whether we really could meet these cost issues. So we commissioned Navius Research and Steve Davis Associates. They're consulting firms that work here in BC for the government, for the utilities, and for many of you in the sector. we asked them to do a deeper dive and to just look at the facilities and determine if we could meet these criteria: reliability, on time, on budget. And their conclusion was any LNG facility on the North Coast could primarily power its production facilities with renewable energy. It could do it reliably, affordably, and on schedule using established commercially available technologies. And further, doing so would reduce the carbon pollution of the plants by 45% and increase local permanent jobs by about 100 jobs per plant. You can check out this modeling. We've just posted it along with a graphic summary of the findings at cleanestlng.org. We'd love your feedback on it. You can send it to us with the hashtag cleanestlng. So to the proponents, this is a new model. It does meet the reliability tests. It's not the types of systems that have been used to date. It uses local winds, so really doesn't put a burden on BC Hydro, which was another one of the criteria. And we're hoping we can discuss this with people to look at how can we get over that inertia about using established systems and look at using these technologies, which I think you all know. It adds about 1% to the sales price of LNG. So I think from a cost perspective, we could come in with the cleanest LNG. So in conclusion, the future really is going to be powered predominantly with renewables, and that future is going to arrive faster than we thought, and things like the Chinese air pollution problem are really going to help drive that as well. The costs for renewables have plunged over the past 5 years. Efficiencies are improving renewables. The scale of investments in renewables is going to mean we're going to have more breakthroughs in efficiency and dropping costs. But natural gas can play a role. It can be a bridge, but it needs to understand its role as a bridge to a renewable future. Gas can firm up intermittent renewable power, and the industry should be planning to play this kind of role with renewables. And lastly, for gas to credibly say it's going to be part of the climate change solution, it needs to be produced with the lowest carbon footprint. We've shown in BC that this is feasible, reliable, and cost-effective with existing and known technologies. And what's required is leadership from government and from the LNG industry, working with First Nations and local communities to see the cleanest LNG realized here in BC. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Marin. Now, I was going to start with some questions of my own, but we've already got quite a healthy selection from the audience, and I know that our time is not as long as we'd originally hoped. So I'm going to start with one for the entire panel, and this gets at, to me, one of the more interesting public policy questions. The panel will be aware, I'm sure, that in British Columbia, we have been working with not only a carbon tax, but also we've been successful at becoming the first carbon neutral government in North America, and we've maintained that status. But a lot of this has to do with how the system of offsets is managed worldwide. And currently, there is no way for British Columbia to categorize offsets from work that might take place in China around natural gas. For the questioner, it reads like this. BC policy, and I would say actually it's broader than BC policy, does not permit proponents to apply CO2 offsets outside of BC. Given Professor Muller's compelling case for taking the global view, should the BC government be willing to change its internally focused policy? I would maybe phrase that to say, so going forward, taking the global view, as policies evolve, as public policy approaches evolve, how should locations like British Columbia and others around the world begin to treat the idea of offsets and calculating their own targets and how their actions around the world should play into that, as opposed to simply looking at their own actions within their own jurisdiction? Who'd like to take a stab at that one?
I'll take a run at it.
Go for
I
it.
think, Minister, it is a tough public policy decision. I think what makes it tough, actually, is on the one hand, more flexibility in the offsets market is desirable. And I think expanding the scope, whether it's within Canada, beyond provincial jurisdictions, or whether it's outside Canada, is helpful in that regard. The flip side of that is, at the end of the day, one of our objectives has to be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. And I think that's what makes it tough from a public policy perspective. We've been big supporters of technology funds, for example, and the reason we're big supporters of them is we think it drives emissions reductions on the ground in Canada. So I think we've got to find the right balance of that, and that is a function, I think, of what the opportunity, assessment of the opportunity in Canada, vis-a-vis the obvious benefit of having access to a broader range of offsets.
Marin.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good policy to keep our offsets here in BC. As you know, we have legislated greenhouse gas targets that we need to meet. There's other parts of our economy where we really need to be reducing emissions because they're going to be increasing if the LNG industry gets off the ground. So I think there's some interesting opportunities in the upstream, definitely, to reduce emissions, which could be done through some kind of tech fund. And I think things like transportation in BC, we really haven't tackled the emissions from that sector. We need to look at how can we use these offsets to tackle one of our big problems is transit and how to fund it, and are there some interesting opportunities there. We really have a public, as you're well aware, who's very supportive of environmental action and climate action, has been for years since we've been a climate leader, and I think is going to be looking to see that if we are building up more emissions, that we're reducing them in other parts of our economy.
Yeah, Professor Miller.
I think there's a danger here, as in many other things, of the excellent being the enemy of the good. And in trying to achieve a local excellence, if the effect is to slow down the development of natural gas exported to China, then the net effect is not going to be as good. I would love to see the export value be considered and be thought of in this context. And the urgent need of China for natural gas shouldn't be ignored. And too much of a focus on the local effect could actually be counterproductive. I'd like to at least see it be considered in all of the discussions. As I think I said briefly, any discussion of global warming in which you omit mention of China and the developing world isn't really discussing global warming.
Thank you. Mr. Zhao.
Yeah, I think for climate change, like CO2 emissions, what is emitted here or in China has the same effects. So if you reduce the same amount of CO2 in China, it also has the same effects of climate saving. But I think this type of program, I think it's still a small program, and we need like a global treaty to make it really effective. And also, I think there are two things maybe BC could consider to do. First is, like Professor Mueller said, about considering this export also as beneficial for the climate. And secondly is China is also in the process of developing the shale gas, and including if you can help China to have the best practice in BC within China, so that would also be very beneficial, for the climate and environment.
It really does require us to think outside of British Columbia. Important for us to maintain leadership, but also important for us to recognize the role that we can play, and I think continue posing the questions to ourselves as well. Speaking of questions, I have another one now. This one's directed at Professor Mueller, but I think probably would be of interest to Mr. Zhao to answer as well. What proportion of China's air pollution is from motor vehicles, and how does natural gas affect that aspect of pollution in China, or does it?
It's actually a fascinating question, and one that we are currently engaged in at Berkeley Earth, trying to understand this. We're doing now a massive analysis of the data available from China, much the same way we did a temperature analysis. In Beijing, for example, we can see it's a great source of nitrous oxides, and that's a serious level of air pollution. And yet it's not a serious source of the particulate matter that's doing most of the deaths in China. So it's very variable. Beijing has been cleaned up in terms of coal. It has not been cleaned up in terms of automobiles. These other pollutants all have a role. Ozone is important. NOxs are important. But the thing that's killing people these days is called PM 2.5. It wasn't even on the list of pollutants in the United States until 1997. And yet we now know this is the main killer. There have been some wonderful studies done in China by Chinese experts showing the level of death that you get from this, not from lung cancer, but from heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And these things typically happen within a few years of the time that you breathe the air. When I was in Beijing and I was in the middle of an air quality index that was above 500, I could do a simple calculation based on the Chinese research that showed that for every minute I lived, breathing that air, I would lose an additional 30 seconds of my life on average long term. So this PM 2.5 needs more attention, and that comes primarily from coal.
Thank you. Mr. Zhao.
I think it's different from city to city. In some big cities, automobile contribute a larger share, like could be 20 to 25% of the air pollution problem. And overall, coal is the bigger source, is contributing 40 to 50%. So altogether, coal and transportation is the most biggest sources. And also for transportation side, the trucks also contribute a lot. Trucks using diesel, they emit the particulates and also NOx. And there's a solution that the natural gas can help. That's using LNG to use for the trucks. That could be a solution to reduce emissions.
Maren, you had a comment to make?
I was just going to comment that one of the things that has really driven the prices of PV solar, for instance, down is China's investment into it. Last year, China actually installed more new renewable energy capacity than they did coal and gas. So that's a real change. We all think of China as building a coal plant every week. Well, last year was the first year they didn't. They built more renewables. And they are investing the same way in electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries. And I think we're already beginning to see the cost of those lithium-ion batteries dropping. And I think as China gets more into the game, we're going to see the same situation where the prices plunge, which is going to help accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles. And I hear that, if you're on the list to get a vehicle in China, if you choose to take an electric vehicle, you get bumped up the list. So that, amongst other things, will help drive the uptake of electric vehicles.
And you make an important point in that as we have this conversation, and we're talking about it in 2014, no doubt 30 years ago, people would not have imagined the conversation we're having. We can't predict what kind of conversation and context they're going to find themselves in 30 years from now. And yet, here we are attempting to plan for that and wrapping our minds around it. I'm going to start with here with a question to Professor Muller that is, well, could be taken a little bit on the humorous side, but I think it speaks to a larger question, and that is finding context for the public. One of the most challenging things that we face as public policymakers is that the science around this goes way beyond the capacity of most lay people, probably most lay people policymakers like myself. And yet here we are trying to search our way through what is the correct scientific conclusion, in many cases around evolving science, and how should we then interpret that into public policy. But I'll start with what I think connects in terms of trying to find context for people, and it's a question for Professor Muller. How does leakage of methane from the gas industry compare to methane liberated from the cattle industry? So, it's context, folks.
First important point to make is that the cattle do emit substantial amounts of methane from their mouths. So you don't get that wrong. And yes,
they ruminate.
They ruminate, and that's how they do it. They don't do it the other way. So there's the humor part. This is a major source of methane in the past. It has been perhaps the largest contributor to methane emissions. So far, the emissions from a leakage are actually quite small compared to the cattle emissions. The fear of the environmentalists is that as we begin to rapidly expand the development of natural gas, that we will do this in such a way that we will have many, many more natural gas than we have now, and so it's a danger for the future. It's not that it's a danger for the present. In fact, I would argue that even people who try to frighten you about global warming, they're in an awkward position, and often they will exaggerate out of the goodness of their hearts, because global warming up till now has been something that no individual can detect. Temperature has risen in the last 50 years by less than 1 degree Fahrenheit. And you can't see that. So people they exaggerate in order to grab your attention. And the danger is when they exaggerate, and then 10 years from now you find they were exaggerating, you lose all interest. The danger is in the future. Yeah. And so with a vast expansion of natural gas, leakage of methane, if it is severe enough, could become a major contributor. That's what they're worried about.
And from your keynote earlier, this gets back to what can you do something about? We can't regulate the cows.
Well,
but we can regulate industry and ensure that things are done using best practices.
In Berkeley,
you're going to tell me you can regulate?
Yes,
the cows?
go vegan.
Go vegan.
This is what I get in Berkeley. If the world were to go vegan, we wouldn't have methane from cows.
My daughter's a vegan. She'd be very proud to hear you say that. So
I'm not
there
vegan.
you go. Now, here's another one for the entire panel. We live in a time of triple bottom line accounting. Mr. Zhao has stated correctly that gas should not compete with renewables. You mentioned previously the concern about what happens if natural gas gets so cheap that renewables can't compete. I think everyone agrees there's a place for renewables going forward. What is that place? But more specifically for British Columbia and for a jurisdiction like British Columbia, what should we be doing to ensure that renewables are part of the energy mix when we are producing liquefied natural gas? And we'll start with you.
I believe we should subsidize renewables. I agree completely that natural gas is a transition fuel until we get to the point where renewables really are affordable to the poor people of the world. And I think we will get there. But in the meantime, natural gas can enhance the value of renewables, which tend to be intermittent. With the natural gas, you can fire up the plant very rapidly on a day when the renewables aren't working. But I'm in favor of subsidizing the renewables. It has to be done in a smart way. You want to subsidize those renewables like PV that I see having a long-term future, but not subsidizing renewables such as large-scale solar thermal, where I don't see the price going down by a factor of 2 or 3 in the next decade or 2. So it has to be done smartly, but I'm all in favor of subsidies to help the renewables develop during this transition period when we are using natural gas.
Yeah, my observation on this would be that I think natural gas is a transition fuel. I would suggest the bridge is fairly long, not short. But I find it a bit ironic to, the question with respect to how do we ensure the renewables have a role in BC, is if you actually look at BC relative to almost any other jurisdiction around the world, BC is a leader in renewables, it is a leader in carbon policy. And I think this is really about how do we develop an LNG industry in BC that creates economic opportunity, that reasonably fits in the broad framework around energy and environmental policy in BC, and creates the opportunity for economic prosperity that then creates optionality for people like you to make decisions about what the energy mix ought to be in the future. But when I look at BC, I see leadership in many, many dimensions of energy and environment, and I don't think BC needs to be at all apologetic about developing an LNG industry in a global context and demonstrating with reasonable balance that best practices are being employed across the value chain.
I'm biased. I think we have a lot to be proud of. I would agree with you there. I think the challenge is it's a lot easier to have that discussion about subsidies when you're in a pre-2008 world and you're returning, annual budget surpluses of $2 billion a year, right? Versus just narrowly managing to balance our budget this year. But, the future unfolds. Mr. Zhao, you had a comment to make about it.
I don't know the status of renewable energy in BC, but for the public policy point of view, in the United States, there's portfolio standards that you require a certain amount, certain percentage of energy come from renewable energy. And we are also trying to build this kind of system in China. So I think this could be a public policy choice.
And Maren, I know you have a comment on that.
Absolutely. Well, I think we can be proud in BC. Most of our electricity is from renewable energy right now. But the build out of the LNG is really where we're going to define whether we're going to stick to the renewable program. So I've outlined and encourage the proponents to look at that. I don't think we need subsidies for renewables, actually. I think that renewables are cost competitive and can be cost competitive. Sometimes they need some support in other ways. We should be pricing carbon much more globally than we are right now. There's a cost to carbon, and that should be factored in, and that would actually level the playing field.
So raise the price of carbon rather than lowering the price of renewables.
That's right. And another thing is, for instance, in Alberta right now, renewables could compete with coal and gas. What they need is long-term contracts. So there's things like that that renewables need to play. And in BC, I think the next step we could be taking is not just investing in this LNG future, but as the world is moving to renewables, Dave and I never agree on how long that bridge is. I think it's quite a short bridge. And I think if you look at what's happened in communications technology, who predicted 30 years ago we'd all be having cell phones and the developing world would go wireless, they wouldn't go landlines. Well, I think we're going to start to see some of those transitions, and we need to anticipate them. And so we here in BC, in addition to investing in LNG, can be investing in innovation and our clean tech sector to be building jobs in that sector as well.
So we're into our last 5 minutes. I'm going to ask our panelists to just give a final few words, maybe emphasis on the few, to wrap up our discussion. And this time, Maren, why don't we start down at your end?
Sure. As I've mentioned, I think the renewable future is going to come sooner than we think. There's a role for gas to really help bridge that and help back up renewables. We need to start moving towards that kind of thinking. Here in BC, we really need to follow through on our commitments around cleanest LNG in the world. British Columbians expect it. Polling shows over 80% of British Columbians want the government to follow through on that promise, want it to be powered predominantly with renewables. We can do it, and we really look forward to talking with proponents. Check out cleanestlng.org, and let's see how we can do it and be a world leader in cleanest LNG.
Great, thank you. David?
Global context matters. It's critically important. We all want a clean LNG industry in BC. We want responsible environmental performance, but it has to be competitive. And we have to look at the cost side of the equation as well. And I firmly believe that if renewable power can deliver cost reliability, minimize redundancy, and so on for LNG facilities, it's going to get a very serious look by proponents. Why wouldn't it? And third, I would say the starting point for BC is already leadership in many dimensions. And I think it's important that LNG fit into that framework in a balanced way.
Thank you. Mr. Zhao?
Yeah, I think from the China's perspective, air pollution is a top one environmental priority right now, and it's killing people right now. And government and the public want to solve that problem very quickly. But it will not be an easy job, and the energy structure change will have to be one important component of that. So China's need for the natural gas is real and strong, and actually, by 2020, China hopes to supply 400 to 420 BCM natural gas, and maybe 50% of that will be from import. So there would be need for like 3 more Russia-China deals like that. So I think there's still a strong need, and for the environmental perspective, and provision of the cleanest LNG to China would be very good, for the environment.
Good, thank you. And Professor Muller?
I would just like to resonate with the previous comment. Everybody here who is an environmentalist, and I think that means most of you, or probably all of you.
It's British Columbia, it's most of us.
that the greatest environmental problem in the world today is air pollution in the developing world. This needs to get more attention. We need to act on this issue. It's not just global warming. Global warming is a serious problem, but this is an immediate problem. And please keep it upmost in your minds in the actions that you take to improve the environment.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank not only our panelists for being with us here today. I think what they have shown is that while there are many areas that still cause disagreement, still cause friction, nevertheless, we have some common goals that we're all striving for. We may differ on the length of the bridge, for example, but we agree that there is a bridge, and we agree that there's a place we're all trying to get to. So if we could maybe just have a hand for our panel and their participation today. And to you all, thank you for your kind attention.